Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention, maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. G'day and welcome to Voice of Gord. I'm Gord. This is my voice. On today's episode, we have a special two-part show for you with my friend Rachel Premack, who is the editorial director at FreightWaves.com. In the first part, Rachel comes trucking with me. She joined me in my Peterbilt logging truck, and we recorded a nice chat, which was a secondary recording because the first one I had forgot to hit the record button. Quite unfortunate. The second part we recorded a few weeks later over Zoom, and we discussed one of Rachel's favorite subjects, which is the Motor Carrier Act of 1980 and the effects of deregulation on trucking as a whole. We went pretty deep and long on that part. That's a little over an hour by itself. Between the two parts, it's going to be almost an hour and 40 minutes. So this is a bit of a long one. My trucking comrades should have no time getting all of that in, but hey, you can always listen to it in sections if you like. I hope you enjoy this. Rachel's a great guest, very well informed. I first met Rachel on Twitter in 2018 when she was working for Business Insider. She's been reporting on trucking ever since, and she's just great. I think you guys will really like this. As always, if you have any comments, send me an email, gordylocks@protonmail.com. If you feel like you enjoyed this, tell your friends, give it to another truck driver. This show is for you. All right, without any further delay, here is myself and Rachel Premack. Hi everybody, welcome to Voice of Gord. Very special episode today where we're actually going to hit the record button. I have in my truck riding around with me today, you're going to hear lots of background noise. I'm actually recording this with a field recorder in the cab of my 579 model Peterbilt with a 45-foot logging trailer behind me loaded to the hilt with various hardwoods. My guest in the non-air ride, very bumpy passenger seat is Ms. Rachel Premack of FreightWaves, formerly of Business Insider. She's a writer and journalist, the impresario of the Modes newsletter. You might know her on Twitter from her seed oil disrespecting and big boat disrespecting, and her commentary on all things trucking and supply chains. She's very graciously agreed to come and visit me where I live near Ithaca and come trucking with me today. So here's Rachel.
Hey guys, and Gord, thanks for showing me around and getting me in the truck and all this. It's been a long time coming. I feel like. Are you okay? Well, okay. Here's some background to this podcast. We already recorded a whole episode, but we didn't hit the record button. This is the one thing, this is why I like being a it's not print journalism, but like a writing journalist, that you don't really have to deal with technology. You just sort of you record the interview and then you write it, but you don't really have to deal with background noise or something. You're just kind of there. But anyways, I've been having a good day. In the truck, good weekend in Ithaca, seeing lots, learning lots, finally meeting Gord after I don't know how many years, 4 or 5 years of internet friendship. So good to, finally meet people in real life.
Yeah, IRL is the best IRL. So, first time in a big truck actually going down the road, correct?
Yes.
What do you think of the view?
Well, okay, so I think I commented this as soon as we got in the truck. It kind of feels like the road is really tiny. Like, it kind of feels like it's like a toy road. I was interested by the door handle being at the bottom of the truck door. I appreciated all the steps to get into the truck. That was very considerate of the Peterbilt manufacturer to include all the steps and the little handles and all that. So, yeah, I think it's fun up here. I could use a little bit more padding in the seat. I'm definitely starting to develop some back issues as a result of this one-day truck trip. What's going on here?
Construction.
I've never seen... We're passing a construction crew where every single, machine, there's a better word for this, certainly, has, like, a U.S. flag on it. I've never seen such a patriotic construction crew.
Yeah, most of them are like that. Guys like to express their patriotism while paving the roads. I don't know, maybe maybe it's an upstate New York thing, but yeah, those are asphalt paving machines. We're on Interstate 81, heading north to Cortland, where we're gonna unload these logs at a place called Gutchess Lumber. So yeah, air ride seat for the driver. Unfortunately, this truck has only got a bolted to the floor passenger seat for Rachel, and we'll give her some ibuprofen to deal with her back. But anyway, yes, this is your first time in a big truck. You've been commenting on trucking and writing about it for at least since I first came across you in Business Insider, and yeah, that would have been 2018. I was probably one of the many people who wrote to you in response to your first ever article on the truck driver shortage. And I've been following you ever since. So tell the audience a little bit about your history, your life in Korea, how you got into journalism, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so I did not major in journalism in college because there was no journalism school where I went. But let's see. So I moved to Korea after college. Lived there for about a year and a half, was a freelancer, was a really bad English teacher for the visa, and then when I moved back to the U.S., I got a job at Business Insider on the careers team, which is kind of a weird section of a newspaper, I suppose, but basically the point of the careers team was to be doing like half resume tips and half like writing about people with interesting jobs. So about a month into me covering working there, I got an assignment to write something about trucking, and I was like, all right, fine, because apparently did very well on SEO. That was the interest in writing about trucking. Is like, hey, there's a lot of search interest in this, which I would soon find out was very true. So, I looked at what the narrative around trucking was at that time, and it seemed like there's a lot of people talking about truck driver shortage. A lot of CEOs were complaining in earnings call, yeah, we can't find any truck drivers. The per mile rate is way up, their wages are way up. It's just so expensive nowadays to get a truck driver. So yeah, that's why I wrote about the quote truck driver shortage. And then I got a ton of emails from drivers, patiently explaining or not so patiently explaining that was completely wrong, that there was no truck driver shortage, that, people were interested in becoming truck drivers, but, look at the turnover rate, almost 100% of people in a given mega fleet will leave within a year of working there. I think it's like a 94% turnover rate. And one of the big issues hitting the industry at that time was the implementation of this thing called the ELD mandate. And that was not being reported really very much. So I wrote a story. I talked to a few drivers who were really upset about how the ELDs had changed their jobs, had made them feeling even more unsafe on the road because they couldn't find parking, because they couldn't get a good night's sleep, because they couldn't, basically work the way that they had been working since, they started trucking decades ago. So That was the piece I wrote. I included my email again at the bottom. I got like an email every minute, it felt like, for like a few days from drivers saying, thanks for writing about this. By the way, you should look into this next. And yeah, I basically have just been like working through that backlog of emails ever since for story ideas. But yeah, I really enjoy writing about logistics and specifically about trucking, but just throughout logistics, there's so many rabbit holes to go down. There's so many, it's a great way to just look at everything going on in the world. You can look at, markets or the economy. You can look at commodities. You can look at labor. You can look at, lobbying power and kind of like crony capitalism. There's so many different, ways to look into logistics and look into trucking, and just so many angles. And yeah, you really never run out of story ideas. So it's a great field to be in for sure as a journalist. And I even tried to stop reporting on it for a year or two, but it was just really boring. Like, nothing's quite as interesting as trucking, in my opinion. So I'm back here happily.
There you have it, gentlemen. An actual female who's actually interested in trucking and has taken the deep dive. They do exist. Go get you some. Rachel's getting married. Actually, her fiance is waiting for her in Ithaca. Good on you, Alan. Anyway, right. So you've been writing for Business Insider for FreightWaves. You have this wonderful newsletter called Modes, and you discuss trucking and various supply chain issues, and have been doing so for quite a while. I've just been sort of bouncing around the internet doing like random writing about similar, maybe more labor focused, maybe more kvetching about the government focused writing. But that's like truck drivers' favorite thing to do, is whine about the government. I just thought about something. So those paving machines, that company's called Suitcoat, and like their main plant is just up north of Cortland in a place called Homer, or near Preble. Anyway, it's layered along 81, and the fellow that owns that place is a pretty interesting dude. And on the side of one of the buildings facing Interstate 81, he's got a sign that's been showing the United States national debt. And when I first moved to America and got my green card and like settled in Ithaca in 2016, I drove by there and noticed their plant and the sign on the building, and it was like, 17 point whatever trillion in debt. And I drove by there the other day, and now it's like 32 or whatever. So this guy's been like having this physical debt tracking sign, and he's got like a big Blue Lives Matter flag. And I hate to assume the fellow's politics or whatnot, but like he seems the kind of guy who really loves America and is concerned about where it's going. So maybe that's why he's got flags on all of his equipment. Right. So yes, Rachel has very graciously decided to come and ride with me, and this is her first trip in a big truck. And I've hosted many hitchhikers before, not always with the imprimatur of a media organization like Business Insider or FreightWaves. And it's good to meet people who are interested in what we do. I think truck drivers as a whole often get a little bit like insular and inward looking and thinking like, nobody's interested in us and woe is me at times. And here we have this lovely young lady who's been writing about us for 4 years, and I think she's doing a pretty good job. And a question I would have about your writing is the difference in feedback you get between, say, like obviously you said you had a large audience of truckers, but you also have the management side, logistics coordinators, dispatch, company managers, fleet owners, people in various other organizations involved in trucking, but like they're not actual truck drivers. So give me a rundown on like the difference in your fan base, so to speak, and their responses to your work.
Yeah. So I would say, let's see. So especially since I joined FreightWaves, definitely, it's at Business Insider, it's obviously a very large audience, but for some reason I felt like I was reaching almost more owner-operators and truck drivers rather than, professionals in the industry, people who are doing like route planning or pricing and setting prices, and people on the shipping side, people who are it's funny looking at who is subscribing to modes, because I've got like an executive from like Sun-Made Raisins and someone from like Wingstop, and there's just like every like random company, which makes sense because obviously everyone's using trucking labor to move their stuff, because that's how the world works. But I would say it's interesting definitely seeing who the subscribers are, because I think since joining FreightWaves, I think my stuff has gotten maybe a little less labor focused and a little more focused on markets and econ and these sorts of things, which makes sense because FreightWaves is a markets place and a place where it's pretty much focused on that.
So, for the people who don't know listening to this show, what is FreightWaves all about as an organization? What's their primary business? And what are all the different things that FreightWaves do? And where do you fit into that?
Yeah, so it is a media and data information company. So the way the business model works is that, you come across a FreightWaves article, we've got some great data on, what's going on in trucking or rail or oceans or wherever you may be. And then, eventually you see enough of these articles and enough of these charts that you're like, okay, I'm going to buy a subscription. I'm going to get like this data platform so I can get the sort of like real-time info and all that sort of stuff. So there are definitely writers and analysts and reporters who go a little bit more niche than I do, like really digging in on like, going from like Des Moines to Dallas right now is really hot, but like going from Los Angeles to Chicago right now is like really, don't even bother, because everyone's trying to do that, so don't even bother trying to send any trucks there. So I'm obviously not going that niche because my newsletter is weekly rather than, every day or every few hours. So I really try to look at things from like a 10,000 foot perspective of what is happening in a certain, sector of logistics. So one good example is, last week at the time of this recording, we got pretty close to the first rail strike in 30 years. Of course, I'd written my entire article about why a rail strike would be really bad, and then as soon as I woke up the next morning, the rail strike had been postponed, at least for the immediate future, so I had to kind of quickly pivot that. So instead, I kind of wrote my piece on, not the rail strike being over, but kind of the next thing of like, all right, the rail strike actually isn't over because all of the workers now need to vote on the contract, and there's a lot of really bad blood right now with these unionized rail workers. They feel like they've been really pushed around for the past 5 or 10 years, if not more. So the idea that they will, vote on this just because the unions, agreed to this agreement is not a done deal. So, the threat of a rail strike is not over yet. So I try to write for people who are like smart and like interested and curious, but like don't have all the details. I basically write like for myself like a week ago before I wrote the story. Like a lot of my story ideas just come from, talking to people and seeing if there's like an interesting topic there, or what is the story. But a lot of it also just comes from like, oh, I don't really understand how this works or why this is the way this is, like, and I can't find any article talking about it, like, I guess I have to write it, which, I would almost more appreciate if someone else would just write it so I wouldn't have to write it, but for the time being, I'm the one who has to write it.
So there's a great combination there of curiosity, entrepreneurship, and autodidactism, whereas you come across something that strikes your interest, you're curious about, the hows and the whys, and then you engage your own efforts to go and talk to the people involved and figure it out. So I thought that's what journalism 101 should be, correct? If I have that wrong?
I think, no, you're right. And I have a lot of opinions on how journalists nowadays go about stories, so we can get into that. But yeah, I would say that is preferably, one good way of approaching the job.
Right, yeah, and like I say, I appreciate your writing, and you're sort of pretty even-handed about stuff, and like you just reporting on things as is. Out there in today's media zeitgeist, there's lots of like political polarization, and then there's like, people who've given up on like, the sort of type of media that are like forever focused on like this narrow band of like, not necessarily culture war stuff, but just like, identity politics and just all this weird crap going on out in the zeitgeist. And there's people who want like raw information about the hows and whys of phenomenon in society, and you're doing the hows and the whys, and not necessarily bringing any editorial judgment to it. You're just like, hey, here it is, I talked to these people, this is like the best of my knowledge, this is why that is happening, right?
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate you saying that, because I definitely really try to, I'm a human, so I have my own viewpoints on things, but I'm never going to get the whole story because I don't work in the industry. I'm a journalist who lives in Brooklyn and, eats sweet green salads and goes to an overpriced gym. So, like, I'm never going to get the whole story because I don't work in the industry. I don't work in the industry as a blue-collar person or a white-collar person or whatever other collar exists in trucking. I have no idea. But I think it's just blue and white from where, my perspective. But, oh gosh, what else were you saying? So yeah, I think a lot of my interest in the topics I'm in right now come from definitely growing up in Detroit and growing up during the financial crisis, seeing so many just economic issues just like kind of destroy communities, destroy like whole cities, like, my parents were definitely really affected by the recession. I just think like economic issues for me are number one. I think they underpin, a lot of other social issues. I just think, kind of digging into why it is right now that we do have this huge, new Gilded Age, as some would say, is kind of my big question, and I think that's a lot of people are really concerned about the way that the country is going in terms of wealth inequality. So yeah, I think that's really my big question, is like, why is it that wealth has been really concentrated in some populations and not so much in other parts of the country or parts of a city even? But I would say that's definitely my big concern, is like, how can we, why is it that our economic issues are the way they are today, and like what could be done, what happened historically to cause this, and yeah.
Right, so I'm assuming you would have addressed that. You recently appeared on the Odd Lots podcast, Joe Eisenthal and Tracy Alloway, correct? Is that out yet?
That, not as of this time of recording, as far as I'm aware. I don't even know when it's coming out, but no, it's not out yet. Okay,
so yeah, as far as like trucking and economics and wealth inequality goes, there's a bill before Congress right now, brought by another Michigander, Representative Andy Levin, called the Guaranteed Overtime for Truckers Act, because truck drivers are exempted under the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act from being paid overtime. Some companies do it anyway voluntarily, and good for them. Most don't. So it's been interesting watching, like, you were already in position in the media discussing trucking in 2018, and then the Wuhan plague overreaction took place, and all of a sudden supply chain constraints and screw-ups were front and center, and everybody's hiding at home and getting their food delivered, and like, oh wow, there was a sense that like, people had to people rediscovered the importance of truck drivers again, and the importance of all these working people that like make society happen, who don't have the luxury of like hiding out at home and dialing it in via Zoom or email. And I think this Mr. Levin guy, whatever else you can say about him or his politics or the party he represents, will at very least realize this and said, hey, maybe we should pay these guys properly and there shouldn't be a disparity between truckers and other workers, at least as far as overtime is concerned. And if this bill passes, and if guys start being paid overtime across the board, it's going to raise the wage floor for everybody else. And I'll take it. Yeah. Did you speak with the Odd Lots guys about this GOT Act?
Yeah, so we talked a lot about AB5 and a little bit about the broker, the Robinson broker case that got passed over by the Supreme Court. But yeah, talking about speaking of the Overtime Act, yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't even, as you said, regardless of your politics, if I'm a trucking fleet owner, and I'm seeing insane turnover, I would maybe think about kind of looking at my wages or looking at the working conditions, because overtime is turnover is expensive. I guess overtime also would be costing a company some amount of money, but turnover is not cheap. Recruiting is really labor intensive and resource intensive, so it makes sense just from a purely economics perspective to look into ways of retaining truck drivers and providing incentives. It's not, I don't know, to me it's not even about quote providing incentives. It's like every other employee in this country gets this benefit as far as I'm concerned. I think agriculture is another big carve out of the Overtime Act, but it doesn't really, there's not really a clear reason as to why truck drivers would not be paid for every hour of work. It seems like painfully obvious. I mean, I'm sure if retail was a big carve out of this, they also the people who run big retailers would also be fighting hand and fist to ensure that a law like this doesn't pass that would affect the retail industries. But there's just all these weird legal carve-outs for truck drivers that I don't think the general population is really aware of. So yeah, I think whatever can be done to I feel like my role in the larger media world is just to inform truck drivers and inform professionals, white collar workers in logistics, hey, this is what's happening in the industry. But even bigger picture is to inform regular Joe Schmoes who have never met a truck driver or a rail worker, and just make them a little bit more aware of how their shit is ending up on their doorstep or on their store shelves.
So yeah, you're channeling a little bit of Studs Terkel, the old, the guy who wrote the book Working, and he was something of a labor reporter on public radio in Chicago way back in the day. Go search Studs Terkel if you've never heard of him. All right, so we're getting pretty close to where I'm going to be unloading the logs at this mill in Cortland, and we'll resume recording afterwards. All right, guys, welcome back to Voice of Gord. This is part 2 of my conversation with Rachel Premack, editorial director at FreightWaves.com and truck freight nerd extraordinaire. I recorded with Rachel in the truck on a field recorder, and she's rejoined us sometime later to get to all the stuff we missed. Good day, Rachel.
Hey, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming back. It's a bummer we're not in the Peterbilt, but you can't win all the time.
Yeah. Well, we got there. How long were we there? Like, it was that was like a 8, 10 hour, 12 hour day,
It
right?
was it, it was a day, yeah.
Yeah.
But like uh, too much distracted driving, just having
Yeah.
you there. Never mind playing with a field recorder and all that.
What listeners might not know is that there was actually a previously recorded episode or a previously done episode. Then we realized we did not turn on the recording. Um, but maybe I felt like the episode that we ended up actually recording was also very good. So but that'll just be lost to the times,
Lost to the
lost to the
ether,
yeah, lost to the ether.
the many miles put behind us as we go down the
Yeah,
road. All right,
exactly.
so today is Saturday, November 19th, 2022. And I believe you wanted to discuss the downstream effects of the 1980 Motor Carrier Act on the trucking business.
Yes, I always am trying to discuss that actually. If I can ever any opportunity I have to discuss it, I'm ready. I'm at the ready.
Well, no, it's funny, like as I mentioned on another show, the there's been some books written about trucking over the years, and the first two parts of my triumvirate of necessary reading on trucking is
Mm-hmm.
Michael Belzer's Sweatshops on Wheels and Steve Shelley's The Big Reg, both of whom go into great detail about what happened after the 1980 Motor Carrier Act was passed and what
Mm-hmm.
that did to the world of trucking, both freight markets, prices, rates, what it did to drivers, how it sort of affected everything. And
Mm-hmm.
you also have some takes.
Yes, I do. Yeah, and there's one other book I'd actually add to that, which I don't think is very it definitely is out of print and it goes in a completely different direction. It's Breaking the Special Interest, Trucking Deregulation, and the Politics of Policy Reform. I'm holding it in my hand right now. That's why I'm saying the exact long title by Dorothy Robin. And she was actually, I forget what exactly her position was, but she worked in Washington at the time when trucking deregulation was passed, and this book was written in 1987, I believe. And it's interesting because it's like the first two books you mentioned correctly go into a lot of the like issues with deregulation, but this book is really interesting because it happens like in I think like the peak of like deregulation is good, free markets is good, Reaganomics is great kind of era. Let's deregulate everything kind of era. So it's like a really interesting book because it's coming from that viewpoint, and you're like, huh,
Oh, and
no
it's
one's really talking like this anymore. And
yeah,
I
well,
could guess I see where they're coming from, why they did this, but
it's also
yeah.
like you say, it's of that time, and I guess one of the things I wanted to say is that I'm not saying that you're saying this, but there's a lot of people within in the trucking industry who are always
Mm-hmm.
blaming deregulation for our plight. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think all of the blame lies completely on the 1980 Motor Carrier Act.
Mm-hmm.
I think the 19 Motor Carrier Act was of a piece of a much larger
Mm-hmm.
set of things, circumstances going on, which include, like you say, Reaganomics, economic liberalization, as they might say
Mm-hmm.
in Europe. Um, and, you have the trend towards companies in America deciding that taking advantage of cheaper labor in other parts of the world meant shipping American, Canadian jobs to Mexico, China, Vietnam, wherever. And
Mm-hmm.
what, later became known as globalization, which was sort of like a way of saying the West wants to carry on its project of sharing progressivism with the world, and a piece of that was like handing off all of our manufacturing everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And with trucking, you can't get rid of it. Like we're stuck here by dint of
Yeah.
geography, right? And you cannot really do that. So instead of realizing this, they instead of they didn't have the robots then, so let's figure out
Yeah.
how it is we can bring all those costs down and have that fit in with this larger jigsaw puzzle. And the Motor Carrier Act was that piece.
Yeah. 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 And you still cannot actually really automate any part of the trucking job. But so it's a really interesting job to track because, you always hear about, okay, well, the reason why blue collar labor has struggled over the last however many decades, or those jobs in terms of their pay and their growth and their, working conditions, you can just say, like, oh, either they were offshored or either they were made redundant by automation and technology. But neither of those really quite work for trucking. So you kind of have to look for other explanations for why the job decreased by up to 50% in pay over the last 40 years, and all of those sorts of things. But I do agree with you that there are other factors. The Motor Carrier Act is just part of this. One thing that I think is often left out of, well, I guess we can probably get into this after we explain to, I don't know how much the listeners will be like familiar with the law or
Yeah,
the
so
deregulation,
please,
but
please tell everybody what was the 1980 Motor Carrier Act? What was its aim? What did it look like? Who are all the
yeah,
players? Like, give us the TLDR version.
yes. So, and then I want to, like, there's like a few caveats that I feel like are not, that I only have learned about like in the past few years since I've written and learned about the law. But um late 70s, it was actually under Carter, not under Reagan. We had already deregulated rail and airlines, but those were two industries that had like really struggled, seen a lot of bankruptcies. And trucking was different. We had not really, it was an industry that by all measures was pretty healthy, not a lot of bankruptcies. It was also supported by, previously to deregulation, uh, every single non-agricultural trucking route was dictated by the federal government. So if you wanted to move widgets from Detroit to Chicago, you had to first check that no one else had that route, which they probably did. And if you wanted that route, you could either buy it for them for what I think would equate to millions of dollars today, or petition the federal government, which wouldn't work, or you
Yeah, well,
could
a good
be
analogy
on a
here.
signed lease, or yeah.
A good analogy here is well, I mean, we're a few years into Uber and Lyft now, but it's like the taxi cab medallion system as applied
Yeah.
to trucking. Like your company has the authority to haul this type of freight from this location into this location and back, and that's it. And if you want to do any other kind of trucking or run any other route, you must buy the authority for that. And the
Yeah, from
government,
someone else,
yeah, that's right. And
most likely.
the government controlled how many of these authorities were issued and who could get them and what the rates were.
And that was all established in 1935. And the big reason why that was established in the first place was because the rail industry was basically pissed that trucking was, getting bigger and bigger and taking um, all of their traffic, which is still kind of the rail industry still kind of names trucking as their biggest competitor, rather than each other necessarily.
Well,
Um,
I think the trucking industry and the rail industry kind of
mhm.
complement each other these days with all the intermodal stuff going on, right?
Yeah. That's definitely a change from, I think JB Hunt kind of pioneered that in the 80s or 90s, or anyways. But yeah, they definitely complement each other in some ways. Also, it's not as if coal shippers are going to be moving their freight via truck. That would just be really expensive and really inefficient. But anyways, so late 70s, obviously historic inflation, stagflation. The federal government was looking for ways to fix this outside of just, raising interest rates. So they looked to deregulate certain industries that would then slash the cost of everything else. And trucking was a big one because they found that consumers would save billions of dollars a year if we deregulated trucking. All of these inflated freight rates would presumably die down a bit. One example, they deregulated, I think, frozen poultry, or I think it was frozen poultry sometime in the 50s, and immediately freight rates for that good went down by like 25 to 30%. And all of that shows up in the end cost of a good. So I believe the total cost of, I believe transportation takes up about 8 to 12% of the end price of a good. So anything you can do to lower that obviously is good for, ostensibly good for consumers. So, the federal government had tried several times to deregulate trucking. Both the Teamsters Union and the trucking industry itself, as represented by the American Trucking Associations and then OOIDA, obviously put up a pretty strong fight to prevent deregulation. But they were finally able to get over those special interests, as this book kind of calls them, the special interests that wanted to keep the trucking industry regulated. And on June 1st, 1980, Jimmy Carter signed into law the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. And by 1982, the industry was fully deregulated, or, no longer under those root controls. And pretty quickly after that, we saw a huge wave of bankruptcies of these medium to large trucking companies, most of which were unionized. And what replaced them were kind of what these quote mega carriers, as well as a bunch of really small owner operator fleets. And practically every company that replaced these legacy companies, none of them were unionized, essentially. So that caused a big sea change for labor. Freight rates did indeed go down quite considerably. Consumers did experience these sort of savings. On the other hand, the job of a truck driver was really hollowed out. Teamsters lost its main kind of membership base, and basically kind of the same thing we saw in other sort of blue collar labor forces, where you have this huge group of people who previously had these really steady, well-paying, decent jobs where they could retire, they could send their kids to college if they wanted to, they could buy a house, they could buy cars, etc. And now it's more of a job where, as Steve Vaselli would call it, it's more of a sweatshop on wheels type of job, where you're really hustling. A decent salary is not guaranteed, and you're most likely, in many cases, you're not necessarily getting health insurance or a pension or any of these other sorts of benefits that the job previously afforded.
Yeah, the race to the bottom in the with Mexican overdrive. Just took it out of gear and let her roll down the hill and see what happens.
And the other interesting thing, and the professor from Wayne State, I don't know why I'm forgetting his name right now, because
Michael Belzer.
Michael Belzer, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry. It is a Saturday morning. My brain is not as crisp as it could be. I apologize, Michael Belzer, if you're listening to this. Anyways,
I'm trying to get him on too. Hey,
well, now that he's heard this insult, I don't know if it's gonna happen. So I apologize. But Michael Belzer makes an interesting point in his book, which is that it's not just these small fleets or owner operators or the employees who are involved in this race to the bottom. It's also the large fleets. Not, and again, I don't think many drivers, especially who are listening to this, will have a lot of sympathy for the quote mega fleets, but they also are in this like really non-productive race to the bottom, where if they decided to increase their benefits or their pay, they would just be like priced out of the game, essentially. I'm sure there's some way they could limit stock buybacks or something to make it work, but it's just an industry-wide thing, this race to the bottom.
On that point about the use of the term mega carriers, I call them legacy carriers. It's been pointed out in a few places that their
Yeah.
relative share of the industry is not that large relative to their outsized influence on things.
Mm,
And I
mm-hmm.
mean, I guess that's a legit criticism, but at the same time, like, I think there was just a statistic I saw that said, 93% of trucking companies in the US have less than 6 trucks or less than
Yep.
10 trucks.
Yep.
I mean, that's great, but I mean, a lot of those smaller company owner operators are either leased on to a larger company.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are competing in the same sector. And, even if you just say, okay, well, large carriers are only 6 or 7%. Well, when you have a market with millions of trucks, 6 or 7% is a lot of trucks and a lot of weight to
Yeah.
throw around, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
the influence of these guys on the market, I don't think should be underestimated.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you. And there's one other interesting number. Let me look it up real quick. But um what you might not expect from deregulation is that the top 10, I'm gonna look this exact number up so I don't mislead any listeners. Okay, I'll look it up later. But the gist of it, I can't pull up the exact number right now, but the gist of it is that um pre 1980 to today, the five largest fleets pre 1980 actually held a smaller share of the market than the five largest fleets today. I don't know the exact numbers. Maybe you can put in the show notes later. But it's even though you might, it's kind of counterintuitive because um, all of those companies were more iconic and more well known. I think back in the day than they are than the large fleets are not exactly household names today. I don't think.
Well,
Um,
the pond was a little bit smaller too, right?
yeah, yeah. But what was I gonna say? Yeah, like they definitely do have a really big share of the market. I saw a number yesterday that only 10, even though 93 whatever the percent is, 93% of the trucking industry is fleets with six or fewer drivers, they only comprise like 10% of like the actual like fleets owned in like the entire industry. So it's like even though they like comprise the majority of like company counts, they don't actually make up that much of the actual trucking industry just because those larger fleets have so many more trucks and as you mentioned have so many leased owner operators, which I think also kind of like muddies these numbers a bit. um
Yeah, but
yeah.
something else you've reported on recently, or maybe not you, but the number of because the market is restricting right or constricting right
Mm-hmm.
now,
Mm-hmm.
and we're seeing a lot of people who bought into the industry as lease operators or owner operators during the crazy freight rates we saw last year.
Mm-hmm.
Now that everything's constricting and kind of falling off the cliff, you're seeing those guys either park or sell their trucks and now enter the market as company drivers.
Mm-hmm.
I saw this weird post on LinkedIn from a guy who owns a few trucks, and he advertised some
Mm-hmm.
positions at his company, and he said that like he got 450 applicants. So he was making
Mm-hmm.
the point that like there's no truck driver shortage, and he
Mm-hmm.
said that of all these applicants he got, many of them were guys who previously owned their own trucks
Mm-hmm.
and who basically washed out of being in that part of the industry very recently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, there's definitely been some reporting on that. I've written about that as well. I mean, even the ATA did lower its quote truck driver shortage estimate from 81,000 last year to 78,000 this year.
Ooh,
So
3,000.
so we've knocked off of at least 3,000.
So speaking of truck driver shortage, and I want to tie this back into the passage of the Motor Carrier Act, is I don't believe there were such things as truck driving schools or CDL mills as we understand them today, as there were in the 1960s and 70s. I think a lot of that training was done in house, especially in places where the Teamsters kind of ran the show, and also the licensing requirements back in the day were different. I remember my dad said, like in the province of Ontario, they didn't have different classifications of truck license like they do today, like a Class A for a semi, Class D for a straight job. Back then, there was just a chauffeur's license, and I'm not quite sure how that worked in the United States, because each state did their own thing, and how difficult it was to actually get what we would now call a CDL. Back then, maybe it was just a chauffeur's license, which meant you can drive and make money. Like, so I'm just curious to know, and maybe you have some insight to this, like, because part of the deal, again, it's not all just about the 1980 Motor Carrier Act, but one of the reasons that things are difficult for drivers and difficult for the market now is there's so many truck driving schools, and the large carriers have their own schools. They get grants and subsidies to run them, so they just keep on churning more people into the business without any regard for retaining them. Whereas prior to 1980, I don't think that was a thing. And I haven't got that far into my own research to know what that was like, and I'm hoping to speak with some people who do. But maybe you know a little bit.
Yeah, no, you're right. So a lot of the ways drivers who I've spoken to entered the industry in the 70s specifically, a lot of the ways that they entered the industry wasn't so much like, oh, I'm going to go to CDL school. It was more, it honestly, I mean, it was a bit like, it's hard to say which system is better, because back in the day, if you wanted to become a truck driver, it was very competitive. You couldn't just waltz in and get a job. You couldn't just waltz in and get a CDL and then, get hired. No matter how good or bad the job was, it was very hard to get a trucking job. As you mentioned, a large reason for that was because of the Teamsters control. So a lot of the ways that drivers would become truck drivers then, maybe they had a family friend who could get them into the fleet itself and get the training then. Maybe they started off as school bus drivers. Maybe they started off as local drivers. I don't have a lot of insight into like the licensing process itself, but I do agree with you that it seems like a lot of it was based on, maybe a little bit more, someone would teach you how to do it and then you would do it. Maybe not so much like the strict legal kind of process that we have today.
Here, I'll put it to you this way. It was probably more informal, somewhat nepotistic.
Yes, it was nepotistic.
But at the same time, more effective, right? Yeah. Because instead of just going by, okay, here's these minimum requirements on a piece of paper and someone's ticking the boxes, you're actually in the truck getting trained by someone and you're doing the actual learning. I was on a podcast with this guy a long time ago named Bruce, Lead Pedal podcast, and we were talking about I think I got you on Bruce's show once.
I don't, okay, if you're the one who connected, that makes sense, because I was like, how did this guy find me? But anyways, that makes sense. I did speak on the show.
I was discussing this with Bruce once, and we talked about a lot of guys got into trucking because they could ride with their dad or their uncle or their grandpa. And now a lot of large trucking companies, because they're dictated to by their insurance provider, they don't allow riders. There's a whole lot less of kids riding around with their parents nowadays. And like I said, as part of the deal prior to 1980 Motor Carrier Act and prior to whatever hot mess we're living in now, that was the thing. And the guys my dad worked for and that I later went to work for in Canada at one time, like all the older
Mm-hmm.
guys told me this as I was growing up, because they were
Mm-hmm.
seeing these changes where CDL mills started becoming a thing, and
Mm-hmm.
there's companies advertising all over the place looking for drivers. They said, it
Mm-hmm.
didn't used to be this way. The paddocks used to have a waiting list. Like
Mm-hmm.
you didn't just walk in here and get a job. Like
Yeah.
you'd apply, and then you would go on a list, and then maybe in a year or two or three, Earl might call you back and say, "Hey, we have an opening now." But it wasn't just like, "Come on in," like it is today.
Right. Right. I definitely do think that like the Teamsters effect on this was part of this. And I think there others have kind of mentioned, the downsides of this as well. I think Teamsters was less racist basically than other unions, but it was more challenging to get one of these union jobs if you were basically not a white guy, because of a lot of which had to do with this kind of nepotistic uh, arrangement we have. The other thing I'd know is that tr- truck driver training, if you're a woman, a lot of like it's very common to be assaulted or harassed or raped even as a female truck driver trying to learn, because you're just paired up with some random guy and you're in that truck with him for weeks and weeks on end. And I think it does make sense to me, like if there was something more like, oh, I have a friend, I have a relative who I'd rather do this training with, instead of some random person that I'm sleeping with who may or may
Yeah,
not be a creep.
I've had this discussion with a couple of people because NPR did a thing about the plight of budding female truck drivers today, and
Uh-huh.
there's one company who shall remain nameless now, so I don't get sued. That was somewhat famous for going out of their way to hire female drivers, and good on them for that. But then they're doing the training model where you're running team with
Mm.
another with another person, which is a bad
Mm-hmm.
model regardless of the gender stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't be running team to learn how to drive. You shouldn't be,
No, that's
because if
yeah.
your trainer's in the bunk sleeping, you're not learning anything, and they can't take over if there's a problem or advise you on
Mm-hmm.
anything. That model is dumb. But it's even worse when it's a man and a woman that don't know each other, and they're being
Mm-hmm.
forced to like live in a box for
Yeah.
days or weeks on end. And like the
Yeah.
whole social dynamic there is just dumb. And so this one
Yes.
company
Yes.
was using this model, and they had all kinds of trouble with like women drivers, with dudes that may not be of the highest moral character,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
or just the human nature of putting two people of the opposite sex in a box, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody here, except to say that that model of training is stupid, and it's
Yeah.
even more stupid when you put men and women together in that mix. And
Right. Right.
my official position on that is that needs to be destroyed, and training via team
Yeah.
trucking should be banned.
Yeah, I mean, it just for all the reasons you've mentioned, regardless of gender, that makes absolutely no sense to do. And like obviously it's the reason I feel like they're probably doing that is because it's cheaper. It's like, oh, well, we already need this to be a team job, so let's just, save money on training instead of having two people on the road doing a one person job. Like let's just have, this is already a two-person job, so let's just also kill two birds with one stone, which is great. And then you have more fatalities, and you know obviously with the gender dynamics, you then have all these other issues, and it's just like, guys, come on. Like this is not like sure, yeah, this is like probably gonna like reduce like costs for your next earnings report, and your like share price or your like
Well,
earnings
sure,
per
but like
share will
the
increase, but it's just long term it's so stupid.
yeah, it
Medium
is.
term
It
even.
is. It's stupid all the way around, and it belies um the big problem here, which is they'll basically go to any length to keep
Mm-hmm.
the churn and entry of new drivers coming into the business regardless of the costs externalized to society in the form of
Mm-hmm.
accidents, in the form of ill pay to people who should be being paid a lot more, and the economic
Mm-hmm.
ramifications of that. They'll do all of this stuff instead of the most simple thing, which is make the job better, treat your employees
Mm-hmm.
better, and maybe pay them a little bit more. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
people are companies, and this mentality of just like, we have to cut everything to the bone and not pay
Mm-hmm.
people what they're worth. Like, at some point, this whole thing just stops working.
Yes. Yes. And we're seeing that on rail right now. And what's interesting about the rail situation is that it's not even a pay issue. These guys are mostly guys like they're not asking they in fact like almost are I from what I read and what I've been talking about with people is that they don't care about the pay. They just want more time off and they want more flexibility with their jobs. And the reason it's gotten so bad is because a lot of these railroads in the mid 2010s cut a lot of their staff in order to cut costs, blah blah blah, increase stock price, etc., etc. Um, but then when COVID hit, it's like, oh crap, we don't have any employees now because there's a quote labor shortage and no one wants to work for us. And the people who are still there are now forced to work these crazy hours. They never get to go home. Um, and they're just called into work at any given time. So it's like in my opinion, usually doing like the decent thing usually works out in the long run, and doing like the craven thing doesn't work out in the long run. Like it all like the house of cards eventually comes tumbling down is
Yeah,
my
well,
perspective.
yeah, I'm waiting for a couple of different shoes to drop here, but like you said, doing the wrong thing and constantly trying to pass the buck in an effort to avoid, you know, a marginal increase in people's pay, or
Mm-hmm.
altering your operation somewhat to make it better for people. And the one thing I will add to this, and I spoke with this with about this with Joe and Tracy on Odd Lots,
Mm-hmm.
was that like trucking's customers have a lot to play in this,
Mm-hmm.
because like trucking companies can only do so much insofar as like, pay and conditions. But like, one of the conditions is that like you go places and you end up in detention a lot,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the freight and refrigerated markets. And
Mm-hmm.
trucking companies don't have as much leverage to do anything about that. And it seems like that side of the logistics supply chain also doesn't care about trying to fix things. I would
Mm-hmm.
love, and I mean, you have the connections to do this. I would love to have
Mm-hmm.
an interview with somebody who works in distribution center management or refrigerated warehouse
Mm-hmm.
management, or someone who's in charge of the logistics side of how these places run.
Mm-hmm.
Sit down and explain to us why, after decades upon decades upon decades of operation, none of these places can seem to get their shit together and get trucks
Yeah.
moving. Because
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
never mind the problem with like holding drivers up and keeping them from their money making potential. You're also holding
Mm-hmm.
up the trucking capacity from being out there on the road, moving things effectively and efficiently, and making the
Right.
supply chain work better, and therefore making the economy work better.
Yeah.
They're just holding everybody up and adding these costs. And maybe I missed it. Maybe there's
Mm-hmm.
another
Mm-hmm.
podcast out there. Maybe there's a book about it. I don't know everything. I don't claim to know everything. That's part of the reason I'm here talking to you. That's part of the reason I've read
Mm-hmm.
so many books and I'm trying to like figure all this stuff out. So if
Yeah.
there's anybody that's listening to this, and you know someone who
Yeah.
runs warehouses that can offer some insight into this, send them to Rachel and she can write an article at FreightWaves. Come to
Yes.
me.
Yes.
Come on the show. Let's talk it out. Like, I want to know why all of this crap is happening, because it's
Yeah.
had like a system wide detrimental effect on a lot of the people that work in it. And
Yeah.
then that effect even permeates into the rest of the trucking market and like deflates my wages, even though I don't haul freight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
The interesting thing, and yes, if you are indeed listening to this and you are in any way involved in warehouses, definitely reach out to me or Gord. Um, Yeah, it is interesting because one other part of this is that if you look at private carriers, their detention time is way lower than um for hire truck drivers. So basically, so if for those who might not be aware of the terminology, basically if you this is not to pick on Walmart, but if you are a Walmart driver, you're probably less likely to be spending time in detention if you are a Walmart truck driver hired by Walmart driving for Walmart than if you are, Joe Schmo who drives Walmart trucks and, maybe you're not a Walmart truck driver, but you picked up, some spot freight to move for Walmart. Um, but you're not an employee of Walmart. Joe Schmo is more likely to be spending those 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 8 hours in detention time
Oh
than
yeah,
someone who is an actual employee of the company
I
that
have
they're
been
of the retailer.
I have been to Walmart DCs. A long
Mm-hmm.
time ago, I used to help out my old boss's brother on the weekends who had a separate trucking
Mm-hmm.
company. And one time I took a load of candy canes because it was pre-Christmas. It was much the same
Mm-hmm.
time of year as it is now in November.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his customers was Allen Candy, and they make candy canes. And
Mm-hmm.
I got this load of candy canes to take from Burlington, Ontario to a Walmart distribution center in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And Marty told me before I left, he said, if the FDA doesn't give clearance for this load, sometimes they do like a little pause and then they'll send paperwork to whoever receives the load after, letting them know they can release it. But if they
Mm-hmm.
don't, if it clears customs but not FDA at the border, don't tell Walmart, because otherwise you'll be there until you get that paperwork, which might be next week. So
Mm-hmm.
just don't let them know that. So anyway, I arrive at I drove. It was like a 5.5 hour drive. I get down to this Walmart DC. They check me in. They give me a door number, and I at that particular Walmart DC, you were supposed to drop your trailer in the door and then bobtail back to this waiting area.
Mm-hmm.
So I drop the trailer in the door. I bobtail back to the waiting area, and I'm sitting there and I'm talking to these guys that are also outside carriers that have brought loads to Walmart for
Mm-hmm.
Walmart to then sort through all their stuff and distribute it to their own stores on their own trucks.
Mm-hmm.
And like the one guy had been there since like 2 days before.
Oh my
Another guy
gosh.
had been there since like 4 in the morning. And
Mm-hmm.
like there's like 15, 20 truck drivers just all sitting there in
Mm-hmm.
at various numbers of hours of waiting, and none of them were being paid.
No.
So
Yeah.
anyway, I'm there, and literally it took them 5 hours to get all these skids of candy canes off. And I'm actually really lucky because there were candy canes and Christmas was coming, so they actually wanted the load.
Yeah.
So in the
Yeah.
world of Walmart wanting that load, it took them 5 hours to get 22 skids off the
Yeah.
trailer, right? So anyway, I go back, I hook up to the trailer, I come back, and before I leave, I go to the office. They give me my signed bill of lading, and then I
Mm-hmm.
hand them this letter from FDA at the border. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, by the way, FDA gave this to me. It was in an envelope. I don't know what they want. I hand it to them. I get in the truck. I drive back out to security gate to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And the phone's ringing at security, and the security guy grabs the phone, and it's literally the people in Walmart's office telling the security guy to tell me to put my trailer back in the dock because they want to put the load back in the trailer because FDA didn't clear it yet. And the security guy's saying, "Hey, can you do like a U-turn and come back? I think they want to put the load back on you." And I'm like, "Yeah, no problem." And I pulled forward and I just kept grabbing gears and I drove away. Because this ain't my problem. Like, your beef is with the FDA. I did my job. You got your load.
Yeah.
You held me up for 5 hours to get it. I'm not getting paid for that. See you
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
And
That's well. What's funny is that you were
that
like, yeah, sure, and then you were like, nope, bye.
yeah. Well, and I mean that scene, but I mean, there's literally a couple of dozen drivers sitting there who'd been there for
Yeah.
days waiting to get unloaded, and I'm like, that happens to thousands of people every
Every day.
single day at
Yeah.
thousands of facilities across the country. And
Yeah.
nobody wants to fix that problem. Nobody seems to care about like this complete and utter waste of human and mechanical capital in the form of all these
Yeah.
trucks sitting everywhere. Never mind nobody being paid, never mind the detrimental effect that has on the trucking labor market because people end up quitting and not sticking around. But like
Hmm.
literally nobody seems to want to fix that. And it would be awesome to find out why.
Yes. No, I agree. I agree. It's like it's it it doesn't make any sense. Like when I learned about this when I started covering trucking, I was like, what? Why is this a thing? It is. I don't think it's very well known. I mean, I've written about it like quite a few times. I probably mentioned it in almost in maybe not all of my articles, but quite a few of my articles I end up writing about truck drivers themselves. I do mention this detention time like bizarrety, and yeah, it's just like it makes so little sense like business wise in every other like way shape or form you look at it. It makes so little sense that I don't think people would even like anticipate that it would be a thing, because as you mentioned, not only is it cruel to human beings to do this, it's also just makes no sense business wise. And this is the interesting thing about trucking to me, is that almost all of the issues that would make the job better for drivers themselves also is just like a seems like a sensible business decision. So turnover, for example, that turnover costs a lot of money. Having to train people all the time, that costs a lot of money. Reducing turnover by however is possible makes business sense, and it's also good for
Well,
workers themselves.
there's a great quote from Vishelli in his book, The Big
Hmm.
Rig, in which he's already pondered that question, and he said
Yeah.
clearly it costs them less money to deal with turnover than it
Hmm.
does with retention.
Hmm.
They've figured it out, and like the bean counters have gone through all this, and they don't care because
Yeah.
and part of the reason why it costs them less is because of grants, subsidies, various things the
Yeah.
government
Yeah.
does for them. And like I say, my mission, as you have known for a long time, is to end all of that.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
like if you take that stuff away from them, then their cost calculus changes, and then maybe they'll start doing the correct thing, which, as you point out, seems correct to everybody that's looking at it and is
Hmm.
better for supply chains, better for business, better
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
everything. But because it marginally costs a little bit more, nope, not
Hmm.
happening. We're going to do it this way for as long as we can. And that's what we're seeing.
Right, right. And you can make those arguments to get those sort of subsidies if you work in the if you run a trucking company, because it's a little harder for, say, okay, I keep picking on Walmart, but if you are Walmart and you're saying like, oh, we have a shortage of cashiers, it's like, okay, I mean, really? But you can, if you say, oh, we have a shortage of truck drivers and they're crucial for upholding the supply chain and we need them to do all of these things, and if they go away, that like the society will collapse, which is all accurate. It is easier to get subsidies to keep that kind of labor on than it is for Starbucks to be like, oh, we have a barista shortage, like please help us, federal government, help us find more baristas, because society is not going to collapse if we run out of baristas. But there are presumably other ways to keep these fleets employed that does not require government intervention or taxpayer funds, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean,
um
well, and the thing that gets me is I asked Steve Vishelli about this because he's been to conferences and whatnot, and he's gotten pushback from people like
mhm,
ATA and various trucking companies, and they
mhm.
they say, "Oh, you must be like some Teamster or something," and like Vishelli's like, "No, I'm an academic. I have no connection to the Teamsters. I've never really done any work with them. I don't."
Yeah.
And then some guy accused me of being a communist for like ironically using the term comrade in one of my Substack posts, but it's like so ostensibly this indicates that like the people running these trucking companies are all about capitalism and free markets in the American way. But what I'm
Mhm.
suggesting is that, okay, cool, you want your free market, let's have one. Stop taking money from the government to subsidize the fact that you don't want to pay market rates for good labor. Labor is a commodity just like any other. And if
Mm-hmm.
you want the good stuff and you want people to stick around, you have to
Mm-hmm.
pay. They just don't want to pay. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's like we don't have capitalism here. We have like various levels and flavors of corporatism, and many
Mm-hmm.
players within the trucking industry are only too happy to take part in that because they
Mm-hmm.
just, why pay people what they're worth if we can get the government to do it for us?
I mean, yeah, it's interesting because there's so many. There's this one book I read recently about Coke Industries, which also, the Koch brothers are really involved in funding all of these various free market enterprises and politicians and so on and so forth. They're really, active in claiming to be extremely all for free market, this, that, and the other thing. But then when you look at how Coke Industries manages to be so profitable, they do take advantage of all these sorts of regulations and loopholes and these sorts of things, and they do really thrive off of, the same sort of crony capitalism that they profess to be so insulted and disgusted by. I mean, I guess it's a very useful, um, like thing to hide behind. Basically, you can say that you are super free market and this, that, and the other thing.
Well, I think the
And then
argument
just,
I think
yeah.
the argument that Cokes and those like them would make is like, yes, we would like the market to operate in this fashion which we would advocate for, but it doesn't. And because it doesn't, we have to
We'll just
make
take
use
advantage.
we
Yeah.
have to make use of all this stuff as well to stay competitive, which is a function of something else. Like I was speaking with our mutual friend on Twitter, Hellbent Hagen,
Mm-hmm.
about the Guaranteeing Overtime for Truckers Act.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, it's great to try and pay people more, but then you have to worry about the other guy. There's always this like phantom other,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
this other person that's going to undercut me, this other person that's going to take advantage of the rules, this other person that's just going to ignore the rules, this other,
Mm-hmm.
this other, this other. So there's always this other that prevents you from doing the right thing because
Mm-hmm.
you live in fear of, by doing the right thing, you'll then be undercut or outcompeted, and
Mm-hmm.
then you'll be out of business.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how much of that's just like in people's heads. Like, is that just like a meme that's like lodged itself?
Yeah. 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 No, I think you're right for sure. I mean, I think there is some truth to it, but there is also a lot of it could just be in your head. Um, yeah, it is interesting to think about. I mean, you could also argue the same thing for the trucking fleets that you're arguing for Coke and all of them, is that, like, sure, I mean, if they can get these government funds, like if the government is gonna be like so loose with our taxpayer money, then like sure, I guess, like why not take advantage of it? It makes sense for them from a business perspective, even though it's, obviously has all these other issues attached to it. If I ran a trucking fleet and the government was giving out free money, it's like sure, why not? I mean,
Do you okay?
I
So in your
yeah.
reporting, I want to bring this back to you, Rachel. In
Mm-hmm.
your you obviously in your capacity as a
Mm-hmm.
reporter and a writer on these things, and you clearly you get to interview many people in the business. You've interviewed folks at the ATA and all these different trucking companies. Like,
Mm-hmm.
is this discussion we're having, or even parts of it, ever brought up with these folks? Like, do they mention it at all?
They do. I have talked to CEOs of trucking companies about this whole thing, and this is just like how it is. I've never really I've never gotten on the phone with someone from the ATA to discuss these sorts of topics. Usually it's over email interview. Actually, no, I have gotten on the phone with them to discuss this. And what they do try to argue about the quote driver shortage is, one thing about it is that even if you did increase pay, unless you increase pay to like, $500,000 a year, a lot of the issues that come with being a driver, the lifestyle issues and so on and so forth, those don't go away, and those still make it challenging to hire. That is one part of the ATA's stance. They also say that other countries also report this sort of driver shortage, so therefore the idea that it exists in the U.S. therefore has more credence, even though these other countries I'm sure have trucking associations that run similar
No,
to.
it's funny you mentioned that because I read there's another trucker with a Substack over in the UK. His name's Graham. It's called the Lorryist, LORRYIST, thelorryist.substack.com, and he wrote a pretty lengthy article, and in it he mentioned the same thing. Like, there's a truck driver shortage in Bulgaria. There's a truck driver. It's like, and I've discussed this in other places too. It's like, so there's like, they used to have this term back in the 80s and 90s called brain drain, of like trying to like take all the talent from other countries and bring it to the West. And it's like now it's like there's like driver drain. But the only drain here is like our wages and material benefits circling the one that like takes you out to the sewer, because like, instead of trying to address the primary causes of the shortage, like you said, the ATA just throws up their hands in the air and says, well, we could give them more money, but that doesn't do anything about the circumstances of the lifestyle. It's like, well, okay, ATA, you have all this heft, you have all these members, you have all this money. Why aren't you like publicly demonizing the distribution center and warehouse industry for continually holding guys up and making things inefficient? Because one way of making drivers happier is a truck driver that comes to work knowing that he's going to be driving most of the time and is going to be treated like a human and like a professional by his by his boss's customers and clients, and not have all his time wasted, is going to be a lot happier and is probably not going to quit as easily, right? So like, it's all great for them to say, well, we can't give you any money, because if we give you any money, we're just wasting it, because there's all this other stuff that also needs to be fixed. Well, let's use your power and influence to help try and get that stuff fixed too, right? Like, and like like we mentioned earlier, there's the whole supply chain in total, and then there's the economy in total, or like the meta level functioning of the economy. And like you said, if Starbucks runs out of baristas, is the economy going to collapse? No. If the trucking industry runs out of truck drivers, is the economy going to collapse? Yes, and very quickly, right?
Yeah.
So like, the fact that these guys aren't taking any effort to try and fix this, and now this sort of like, Western capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, has been like exported around the world, you're seeing the same problems happen everywhere else. So it's like, okay, cool. So like, if we are experiencing all these problems here, and it is our ideas and way of doing business that are now causing them in other places, and we're trying to poach those guys' drivers, maybe it sort of like behooves us to have a collective discussion about like, let's try and fix this stuff. And they're not, and it's me and talking to you, and I'm nobody, and you're a writer at a little website, and
hey.
Okay, I'm not trying. No. FreightWaves is a big deal. I'm just saying, like,
no, I get it.
No,
I have no control over how anything works. I can comment on things and ask people how it works, and show other people like what I've learned and what people are saying. But no, I am not someone who I can't really do anything other than show people what's going on.
Sure, exactly. And that's a good spot to be in. And I appreciate it. And I appreciate the works FreightWaves is doing and Back the Truck Up. And like, the more we talk about this, maybe we'll get a couple more ears and we'll slowly march towards fixing it. But my point is that, the people who are in a place to fix it and have the power and have to do something are not, because they're economically incentivized to maintain the status quo. And it's like, there's little people like me, then there's like Elida and you, and it's like, people need to realize, like, in this interconnected global economy, that supply chains matter. And I'm glad people are starting to see this, especially after COVID. But it's like, okay, cool, here's a way to like fix some of that and make sure that this thing doesn't fall apart. And often enough, it feels like it's falling on deaf ears, because the people who are in charge of this either appear to not listen, or when presented with these issues by someone like yourself, they dissemble.
Yeah. I mean, it all goes back to what, Vaselli calls the destructive competition, where if one trucking company, even I think they could band together. Okay, I guess that's what the ATA is, them banding together. Um, yeah, like a sort of, coalition of fleets or a union of sorts could band together and say, hey, we're not servicing X, Y, and Z shipper who we've identified to be some of the worst abusers of these detention policies. Like, this is like, you're on notice kind of thing. Like, that is something that could be done, and I believe happens in other industries where, you're kind of working together, you're trying to, make it clear that, like, we cannot run our business if you keep acting like this. But I think it does go back to what you're saying about, like, the mysterious other, like, oh, if us large fleets get together and say we're not doing this, then all of those, like, dastardly owner operators and, like, small fleets are gonna, like, they'll step in, which I don't think is true, because a lot of these large, especially these, like, large grocery shippers, they run a lot of it is run on contract freight. Like, it's like the contract freight still does make up the vast majority of the trucking world, and a lot of those contracts are with large carriers. So I think there is a way to work this out somehow, and it is, yeah, like, I think I can't just keep going back to this idea. It's like, when, like, the more I've learned about trucking, the more I don't understand how anything gets anywhere, because it's just all of these things are just like, really, like, people have to wait 8 hours to unload groceries, and then you add on to those, like, wait, this is like refrigerated goods. It's not like this is just like, toys sitting in a van. Like, there requires, like, fuel and energy to keep this truck, like, cold. Like, I don't know, there's just all these sorts of things that are like, the more you put it together, it just gets more and more insane to me, at
Yeah,
least.
I think what's happened, and it's part of it, is that and when I say we, I mean like truckers and the trucking industry have just taken so much abuse for so long,
Mhm.
especially downstream of the 1980 Motor Carrier Act, that we've just internalized it,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we've masked all these problems by kind of like being Job, just accepting our punishment from God and
yeah.
just keep going. And and on the other hand too, like, one of the things I wanted to mention about downstream of the Motor Carrier Act is, as much as that's caused a lot of these problems, it's also opened up opportunities for smaller carriers, like the guys I used to work for in Ontario,
Hmm.
who used to have customers call them and say, hey, this one trucking company here that's organized by the Teamsters, they're
Hmm.
too slow, they're not looking after us, can we get you guys to move some loads?
Yeah,
And my boss would say, well, we can't, because we don't have that authority. And then they would have to do it
right.
illegally, and there was all kinds of, like,
Mm.
guys running around with like fake authorities, or they would have these methods, like the Paddocks used to paint their trucks to look like Kingsway Cabano, which was this old trucking company in
Oh
Canada.
my gosh.
And they would use the colors, so like if they were in certain provinces and the truck rolled across the scale, they wouldn't get questioned because it would look like a Kingsway truck,
That's
right?
really funny.
And
I didn't know that was happening, but that's really funny.
yeah, and there's, oh no, there's all kinds. Man, I have to interview Scott Paddock one of these days, because the story.
Yeah.
So they used to carry typewriters in their trucks in
Huh.
order to type out trip leases, because back in the day you could get away with hauling stuff as long as you had like a trip lease. So like,
Yes.
you, as the driver in this truck, and the people that own that truck, you're leasing it to somebody else who's owns the material in question, so you're
Hmm.
acting as an agent for them rather than as a third party carrier. So there was this
Hmm.
like technical way of getting around authority. And like,
Yeah.
guys would type up these fake bills of lading and these fake lease arrangements in order, like, lease trip leases, so that in case they
Hmm.
got pulled over by the Department of Transport looking for their authority, they could get around. There was just all this kind of dodgy stuff guys used to
Yeah.
do in order to get things moved, because, like, on the one hand, yeah, prior to the Motor Carrier Act, things were good, quote unquote, but like some
Right.
people, some companies did have trouble getting their stuff moved. And so
Yeah.
like there's these sort of nuances with it. And again, we need to, I need to interview people much older than us who were around back in the day to tell us
Yeah.
more about that.
Yeah. No, I feel like I've definitely learned a lot about the trucking industry by, as you mentioned, by interviewing people who got in pre 1980. So that's the other kind of interesting thing about the pre deregulation era, um, is that, well, okay, one quick aside that I like have been learning more and more about recently. But even though, like, I would put myself in this group. Like, a lot of people are like, "Oh, it was so different back then." Like, like, let's get back to that era. Okay, I don't think I've ever said that because that would be outside of what's journalistically acceptable for me to like advocate for things like that. But um, like a large percentage of the freight market was also not regulated prior to 1980, and that's all agricultural goods. So there were quite a few unregulated, deregulated carriers prior to 1980. They were just hauling farm goods, which is, all food, which is a pretty big, chunk of the whole freight economy. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that, yeah, you're right. Like, there were all these issues that would like stymie, small businesses from flourishing. It was really based on timing. Like, if you happen to have a trucking company in 1935, like, you're golden because you were grandfathered in, you got all those authorities. But if you for some reason were not a trucking company in 1935 or 33 or 4, what have you, you're kind of you basically had to you really couldn't get into the industry. And I think this is also kind of like forgotten as well, but the Teamsters were very corrupt back in the day. I mean, and the Teamsters did really support this whole system, and that was also pretty supported as well by the mafia, aka violence and chicanery and corruption, these sorts of things. So obviously, this regulated system was, I would say, good for the majority of drivers and arguably American society as a whole to have, this large group of well-paid, working class guys mostly. There were a lot of kind of like, underbellies, I guess you could say. And this was one reason why it was deregulated in the first place, is because people just like were sick of the Teamsters and sick of Jimmy Hoffa and sick of the sort of like violence and things associated with it. Um, Again, I think there are a lot of unintended consequences of all of this, but it's good to keep that in mind of like, oh, this is why people were upset at this industry and did want to deregulate it.
Right.
Um,
I mean,
yeah,
things don't just happen in a vacuum, and
yeah,
oftentimes, all times, they're multifactorial, and there's lots going on. It's not just like,
yeah,
evil capitalists came and ruined our time.
yeah,
There's usually a bit more to it, and I
yeah,
I
yeah.
get that. I read a really good book on Jimmy Hoffa,
Hmm.
um, by this guy named Thad Russell, which I also heartily recommend everybody. Jimmy Hoffa and
Hmm.
oh, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but the argument Russell makes is that Hoffa took a market-based approach to running the Teamsters. I mean,
Yeah,
setting aside, some of the like uh, shady mafia
yeah,
dealings, his operating approach to increasing the Teamsters' power was to offer the Teamsters customers a better deal. And who are the Teamsters
yeah,
customers? The membership. So, like,
yeah.
if you move into a local market and claim, and you're the Teamsters, you say, listen, come be in our union. We will get you better contracts. We will get you better time off. We'll get you all this
Hmm.
stuff, but you have to be members with us. And then you actually deliver that. You do get better contracts. You do get better pay for your membership. Then people are
Hmm.
going to come to you. That's like a market based approach, which is something
Hmm.
that, most unions kind of have an antagonistic relationship with capital,
Yeah.
So Hoffa's was like, I mean, he might very well have been an antagonist in many ways, but like he sort of
Mhm.
understood how markets worked, and he
Yeah.
understood that this was the way to make the Teamsters better, bigger, and more powerful, and get more people.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, maybe some people might want to argue that, but I think Russell makes a pretty good case for that in his book.
Yeah.
You know, he pulls no punches. There's baseball bats and fist fights and stuff along the way.
Yeah. 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 You gotta have all of that. Well, and then the other interesting thing is that I from what I understand of that era is that there's also like a lot of like mergers. That sounds like I said murders, which makes sense based on what we were just talking about. But there's a lot like it's kind of weird to think nowadays of like mergers of or acquisitions of unions because they've kind of lost a lot of their power at this point, or at least kind of in a lot of industries they've definitely lost their power. But yeah, there was like M&A of unions at that time. um and I do agree with you on the antagonistic kind of like relationship with capital. I think, and Justin Martin, my coworker and our mutual friend, he's also kind of discussed this, is that like most workers aren't trying to like seize the means of production and like rehaul the entire system. It's just like, yeah, I would like a raise and like healthcare and like retirement benefits. Like I'm trying to like still live day to day and like hang out with my family and like go to sports games and go shopping. Like I'm trying to like live the life I live now. I would just like it to be like comfortable and for my kids to be able to go to college or do whatever they'd like to do. So I do agree with you that it was definitely a different approach to unions, I think, back in the day, than we kind of see now in a lot of the organizing, or at least in the loudest minority of people who are involved in unions nowadays.
Yeah, and for those listening, union representation in the trucking industry is like what, 5 to 7% of drivers at best.
It's got to be lower. I think it might be lower than that, but that does sound in less than truckload or LTL, it tends to be a little bit more unionized, but it's a lot of people don't actually realize that truck drivers are not unionized. So it is interesting. It's like I feel like I have this conversation a few times a year where
Well,
people
you
are
could,
shocked.
yeah. Well, part of the reason we're here is you could shorten that sentence. A lot of people don't know anything about truckers. Period.
Period. Yes. No, you're right. You're right. Absolutely. It is funny because pre-COVID, if I said I covered the trucking industry, people would make some like dumb comment like, "Oh, well, they're all going to go away because of driverless trucks." And it's like, okay, yeah, sure. I got sick of correcting people at a certain point, but now like people are actually like a little bit more informed, a little bit more interested, which is good. But um, yeah, I think it is changing slowly, and I think people are still interested in like supply chain topics post COVID. I think people, even though everyone's now able to buy their toilet paper or whatever, I think people have gotten a glimpse of this world, and now they're curious to learn more, which is
Well, hopefully
good for me.
hopefully we can help keep their attention focused on it and help
Yeah.
affect some positive change. And on that note, thank you for your time and coming and hanging out with me to talk more about
Yeah.
this, Rachel. I'm not sure when I'm gonna actually get this thing launched. It seems like it might be the new year, but
Yeah.
once I get it out there, I'll let you know.
Video again.
I understand you're going to Pittsburgh tomorrow.
Yes, I am going to Pittsburgh tomorrow. I'm spending Thanksgiving there with my fiance and his family. So I think it's like a 6 hour drive, so not bad.
All
What are
right.
your plans for Thanksgiving?
Um, my sister's coming down here from Canada. We're going to my other sister's for dinner, and then my wife's uncle's coming, so we're having two dinners, one Thursday, one Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday I'll probably be trying to do more writing. I've got 3 major writing projects sitting in front of me, and they're still not done, and they're not getting done any faster.
Well, welcome to my life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, and
Yeah, of course.
I'll let you know once this is all out. And thanks everybody for listening to Voice of Gord and Voice of Rachel.
Voice of Rachel. I like that. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Gord.
All right. Happy trails.
All right. Let's see. Just waiting for the little recording guy to go. Well, I guess I can still talk. It's not
Okay,
like they're
hold
gonna
on.
like.
I'm going to hold on. I'm gonna stop.